Welcome back, my gardening friends, to another Focal Point Friday episode. Let's spend just a few minutes together reviewing a snippet of information from a previous episode, highlighting a new topic, or quickly focusing on a current event in the food and agriculture world. Let's get down and dirty. This week for Focal Point Friday, I want to jump back to last season and talk about the basics of starting a compost pile. This is the time of year when we not only start to have a lot of yard waste and garden waste, but we generally have food waste coming out of our kitchens year round. So now is the perfect time to put all that waste to good use. The average American produces about 1,600 pounds of garbage every year, and approximately 75% of this garbage is organic material. That means 1,200 pounds of the 1,600 pounds of waste produced could be composted. That's per person. We don't want that organic material going to the landfills and causing methane gases to add to the atmosphere. So let's talk about the basic ingredients of a compost pile. It does not have to be difficult. Now, if you want more information on this topic after listening to today's episode, I'll leave a link to all the composting episodes in the notes for today's show, which you can scroll down to in your podcast player or get to from my website at justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. So let's talk the ingredients of your compost pile. All composting requires 4 basic ingredients: carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen. Okay, so where do we get these ingredients? We call the carbon ingredients browns. This includes materials like your dead leaves, branches, twigs, hay, straw, any of your paper products, anything that is dry and fibrous or that's kind of hard and bulky is going to take up space in the compost pile. This stuff is a little bit more resistant to decay. Consider the browns, the carbon, the slow burning fuel for your compost pile. It provides energy for the bacteria and the fungi to do their work in your pile. It also provides good texture. It provides those air pockets so that oxygen can get to those microorganisms. The browns are what provide the structure for the humus that we want to develop, and that's the final product that we really want to add into the garden. The browns that you're adding to your pile, if you're using cardboard and other paper products, you really want to be sort of shredding them up. They may not be a great food source, but it does provide structure, and it also keeps that stuff out of the landfill. Just try to keep the ratio of these items a little bit lower than that of the other browns that you've got. You also want to preferably shred the dried leaves so they don't get matted, and it provides better airflow. This also goes for things like corn stalks or corn husks. You want to chop those up too. Any really big limbs and stuff, you also want to break those down a little bit. Another thing that falls into the browns category would be wood ash. Wood ashes are also high in potassium. So, we talked about that before, potash. It's an essential nutrient for plant growth. This is why you want to put wood ashes in the compost pile instead of putting them straight into your garden bed. Because remember, we talked about wood ash being very alkaline, and so it can change the alkalinity of your garden soil if you're putting it straight into it. But if you put it in the compost pile, it actually would become more beneficial. So you want to sift those ashes to get rid of any large pieces and then toss them in. You do not want to use coal ash. Coal ash has very large amounts of iron and sulfur, so you don't want to use coal. You also want to avoid using the charcoal from your barbecue. That stuff can resist decay for a very, very, very long time. To improve the decomposition of the browns, it's a really good idea to chop them up, shred them, do what you can to pulverize them a little bit so that they do speed up their decomposition a little bit, but no matter how you get them in there, they're going to do the job. Now, on the opposite side of this, we have our nitrogen source. Those are our greens. So we've got our browns for carbon. We've got our greens for nitrogen. This includes things like grass clippings, your vegetable waste, your fruit scraps, coffee grounds and the filters. These are soft materials. This is the fast-burning, high-octane fuel for your compost pile. These are the wet ingredients, for lack of a better description. Where the browns are dry and hard and they take up space, the greens have a higher moisture content and they tend to kind of collapse quickly in the pile. Manure from farm animals is a classic greens ingredient. Things like rabbit manure, horses, goats, chickens, those are the most popular. Just about any herbivore, you can use their manure in the compost pile. It's a great source of nitrogen. And it's often mixed with bedding like straw or wood shavings. That also adds some of the carbon, so you've got the browns and the greens going at the same time. Feathers are also a high nitrogen source of greens. Spent grains and hops fall into this category too. So if you're doing some home brewing or you know someone who is, the leftover sugars in the waste product of that brewing are great food for the microbes in your compost pile. Just spread them out thinly so they don't clump up to create an anaerobic condition, and they will feed those microbes nicely. Breads and pasta are green too, but just make sure that anytime you're adding food waste like this to your pile, you want to bury it into the pile to avoid any critters from helping themselves. Used potting soil is considered a green, and it can be added to your compost pile. I always do this at the end of the season when I'm emptying pots and containers to sterilize them for the next season. The same thing goes for spent plants from the garden. A word of caution on both of these, though. If you've had any sign of disease or you've had a heavy pest infestation, you may want to skip this step. If your compost pile doesn't get hot enough to kill the disease or the insect eggs, you'll just be adding that material right back into your garden again and continuing the cycle. Now, if you have a closely managed compost pile that is reaching the correct temperatures, which we'll talk about shortly, then go for it. And just be sure that these items end up in the middle of the hottest part of the pile. One other one to talk about is eggshells. These don't really fall into either the category of browns or greens, but they do add calcium to your compost, which of course is good for your plants. Eggshells do compost best if they've been ground up or at least crushed before adding them to the pile. So the next ingredient would be water. Having the right amount of water is important for compost development. And that fourth ingredient is oxygen. And obviously we already talked about this. Oxygen is responsible for that aerobic breakdown. So let's talk about the ratios of these things, right? Your compost pile should have about equal amounts of browns and greens. So you should also be sort of alternating those layers of the organic materials and the different size kind of pieces. Remember, the brown materials are providing the carbon for your compost, and the green materials provide the nitrogen. And then we're going to add some water to provide the moisture to help break down that organic matter, and then the oxygen keeps the microorganisms functional and doing their part. This is why you hear people talk about watering and turning the compost pile. So how much water? Ideally, you want your compost moist but not dripping. Okay, a compost pile should be about 40 to 60% water, but this includes the water content of those green ingredients. So if you touch the compost and it has the wetness of like a wrung out sponge, then you're golden. But if it's bone dry, either you've got too much brown and not enough green, or you just need to water the pile down a little bit. You shouldn't have liquid running out the bottom of the pile, and there shouldn't be any kind of a smell either, other than some nice earthiness. A pile that's too wet or has too much green can start to smell a little bit like rotten eggs, and so that's your cue to kind of adjust things. Now, how much oxygen? Well, as much as you can give it. This is where turning your pile comes into play. Will it decompose without turning? Absolutely. Will it go faster if you do turn it? Absolutely. And turning your pile will keep the microbes in the center from running out of food and oxygen, so they can keep doing their jobs. Plus, it prevents that higher nitrogen greens from becoming stagnant and start to stink. This is usually the main culprit of a stinky compost pile. Too much green, not enough oxygen. So you can go about turning your compost in a couple of different ways. Either mix the pile around every time you add fresh materials, or put a note on the calendar to flip it around every 4 to 6 weeks until it really starts to cook, or get yourself a tumbler or a barrel that can be turned or rolled every time you add something new. There's no hard and fast rule here, because what your pile needs is going to depend on your green to brown ratio, how much moisture is already in the pile, and how big the pile is. Scientifically speaking, the oxygen level should ideally be 5%, but you have no way to measure that in a backyard setting. So after a while, you're going to be able to tell if the stuff in your pile is breaking down properly and adjust your actions from there. Thanks for joining me on this Focal Point Friday. I'll be back again on Tuesday for another regular episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. So until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon.